Building web apps with React is not just about composing components together and making sure that the logic works correctly. That arguably is the most important part, or at least it's the biggest reason for using React. But building React apps is also about styling those apps. You want to make sure that your applications look good. And styling is also an important part of building components. And there are different techniques for setting styles dynamically and for styling components such that other components are not affected by a specific component's styles. Therefore, in this module, we will dive into how you can set up styles in a conditional or dynamic way. So how you, for example, can switch certain styles based on some conditions. For example, if a user enters an invalid input and you want to color the input field red, something like that. And then we'll dive into two popular approaches for scoping styles to components. So for setting up styles such that they only affect a component and are not added as global styles. We'll have a look at styled components, which is a third-party library, a very popular one, which allows us to set up pre-styled components with their own scoped styles. And we'll have a look at a concept called CSS modules. And you will learn what these different approaches are all about, how you do work with them, and how you could add them to your next project. Now, to dive into styling, we need a demo project, and to mix things up, I got a brand new project here. Now, I already prepared this one for you. It's a very simple project, as you can tell. You can basically add course goals, like learn React, and that will be added to this list. You can also delete items from there by clicking on them, and that's basically it. This project uses only things which I covered over the last course sections. And of course, you find that project attached. You can simply download it. You find the entire project folder there. And then, once you downloaded it, simply open the terminal, navigate it into this project folder, and run npm install. This will install all the third-party packages which are required, since the attached folder does not come with a node modules folder, because that would unnecessarily bloat the attachment. npm install simply installs all packages and recreates the node modules folder. And thereafter, you have this project here, which you can start with npm start to start the development server and play around with the project. Of course, also feel free to dive into the source files to see how this project is structured. As I already said, this project only uses features which you already know, like use state and functions which are bound to events. And we're then, for example, also outputting lists of data dynamically by calling map. So that's all something you already saw, and there is nothing new there. This, however, will be our starting project for this section, where we are now going to dive into styling. So definitely explore the source code files so that you understand this project, and thereafter we're going to have a look at the different styling options React gives us. So as mentioned, we are going to work on this project, and therefore make sure that you have the project set up as instructed in the last course lecture. We actually already have some styling in this project, certainly not the worst one. I think it looks quite decent, but there are things we can do about this project nonetheless. For one, we might want to change the way styles are applied, because at the moment we are using regular CSS with regular CSS selectors, like this class selector. And as I mentioned, this style, even though we're importing it into the course goal list component, is not scoped to that component. It would affect any element on the entire page which has a goal list CSS class. So that's one thing we'll tackle. But we'll start with something different, with setting styles dynamically. And a great example can be found in the course input component. There we are collecting some input by the user, and then we have the add goal button to, well, add a goal. In the moment, we can press that add goal button even if we didn't enter anything, and the result is that we add an empty element here. Now, in most applications, we probably want to avoid this. And we don't just want to avoid this, we also want to give the user some feedback about the incorrect input. And that's something we'll build now, and that's something for which we'll need to set styles dynamically. So in course input component, it's the form submit handler where I in the end want to check whether something valid was entered before we trigger that onAddGoal function. So that function we get on this onAddGoal prop, to be precise. For this, we can add a simple if statement here in the form submit handler and check if the entered value, if we trim it, trim is a built-in method that removes excess white space at the beginning or the end, and I use it here to rule out that the user just entered a bunch of blanks. So if we trim this and we check the length, if the length is now equal to 0, we know that the input is essentially empty. In that case, I want to return here. Hence, this line of code will not be executed because function execution stops when you return. And we're done. But the problem now is, now we made sure that we can't add empty goals. I'm hammering this button and it doesn't do anything. This works, however. But even though we added this, we don't give the user any feedback. And that's exactly where we now need our styling. I want to add a red border and a slightly red background color to that input, and also a red color to that label if the user entered something invalid here. Now, how can we achieve this? Well, we can manage an extra piece of state here. And that state could be an indicator for whether the user submitted and entered something valid or not. So it's a true or false choice, and therefore we'll be working with a Boolean. And initially, let's say, we trust the user. So initially we set this to true, and I'll name this state is valid, and the updating function set is valid. Now, as long as this is true, I consider the input as valid. If we make it into this if block, though, I know it's invalid, and therefore we can call set is valid and set this to false. Because what the user entered and submitted definitely is not valid. Now, if this is false, I want to apply the styles I just said. And the easiest way of doing that is to add the inline style here to the label, for example. And as you learned, you need to set an object there. The inline style prop here wants an object as a value. And in that object, you target the different CSS style props in JavaScript that you can set for this element, for this component. So for example, here, the color property is available, and we could set this to red. But of course, we don't always want to set this to red, but only if the input is invalid. So I check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I set this to red. Otherwise, I set this to black, for example, which is the default color. And that should allow us to dynamically set this to a red color. We use the style prop, we pass an object to it as demanded, but we dynamically change the value that's fed into the color property in that style object. And therefore now if we save this and we go back, if I submit this without entering anything, you see that label becomes red. Currently we then never reset it, but that's a first important step. Now we need to also change the border and background color of this input, and that's definitely something you can try on your own. Here's a short break which you can take to pause the video, thereafter we'll implement it together. Were you successful? Well, adding it shouldn't be too hard. We add the style prop again, pass in an object because that's what it wants. And now we can set the border color, and that's the only tricky thing. It's border color written like this because we're in JavaScript here, not in a CSS file, and therefore we need to use the JavaScript property name for that CSS property, and that happens to be the camel case version of the CSS property name, hence border color written like this. And I also want to set this to red if this is invalid. So the value is exactly the same as up here. And therefore, of course, we could also refactor this into a separate variable. For the moment, since I only need it in these two places, I'll keep it like this. And we also need a background And here again, I check if this is invalid, in which case I color it red, otherwise black. Now this red might actually be a bit too much, and therefore maybe here we want to use something else. I think salmon should be good. And that should not be black but transparent, because of course I don't want a black background in the input, I want a transparent one. With that, if we save this, now if I click add goal, it's colored like this. Now it's also never reset at the moment, but at least we got the conditional styling. And of course you can play around with the exact color values to, well, get a different styling. Now, two notes. For one, of course, we want to reset this eventually. And second, I'm not 100% happy with that, because with this approach we currently have here, we always set inline styles, which of course have the highest priority in CSS. So you override all other styles with that. Now actually I'm happy with the default styles we set up in course input. For example, for the input, I have a border color of this light grayish color here. Now, needless to say, we could set this up here as well. I could reset this to this grayish color, for example, instead of black, so that when we reset it, we go back to this predefined color we have in the CSS file. But still, we have some duplication here. We got a base color scheme here in the CSS file, and then we override this with inline styles just because we want to conditionally set some specific styles if the input is invalid. And that's why I'm not 100% happy with those inline styles. So let's now quickly work on the reset functionality before I then show you an alternative to setting dynamic styles with inline styles. Now, to work on that reset functionality though, all we need to do is go to the place where we react to every keystroke. And in the end, we just need to check if event target value, which is the entered text, if that is now basically valid. So if we trim it and get the length, if the length is greater than 0, if it is, we know the input is valid, and then we could call set is valid and set this to true again. And here, of course, we need a dot. And with that, if we go back, if I submit this, this is red, but if I start typing, you see it's no longer invalid. But if I submit it in an invalid form, it of course still becomes red. So that's working, but as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned, I'm not 100% happy with the inline styles because they take a very high priority, and you can certainly always find ways of making it work, but I personally would prefer to not set inline styles. So let's have a look at an alternative. Which alternative could we have to setting inline styles? Well, how about the following alternative? What if we could add a new CSS class to this div, which holds both the label and the input, and we would add this class dynamically only if the value entered is invalid. That could be something like a invalid class here. The name is totally up to you. So this invalid class should sometimes be added here on this div. And then in CSS, we could prepare the fitting styles. For example, here we could say, if the form control also has the invalid class, and therefore make sure there is no space between form control and this dot, which means they both have to be on the same element, then we could target our input and set the border color to red. And we could set the background to red, or actually now pick a much lighter version, like this very light rose color here. And if the form control, the div with the class form control, has a class of invalid, we can also target the label and set its color to red. So these here would be two CSS rules that should lead to the desired output. And all we need to do for these rules to have an effect is we need to add that invalid class dynamically. And here's how you can add classes dynamically. Let's get rid of these inline styles. We don't need them anymore. And instead, let's see how we can change this class dynamically. It's very, very easy. Since we need a dynamic value, we need curly braces. Because a string is always a string. It's a hard-coded string, so we need curly braces. And now what we feed in, of course, still can be a string of form control, but a string where we dynamically add more text in it, where we dynamically expand it or concatenate a value to have this string, invalid, instead of this string. So what we pass to class name on this div sometimes is a string that looks like this, and sometimes will be a string that looks like this, depending on what the user entered and depending on our isValid state. And for that we can use a nice construct. We can use backticks here. Now, in case you're not familiar with this is a default JavaScript feature. It's called a template literal. This constructs a string, but we have backticks here, not single quotes, but backticks. It's a special character on your keyboard. And whatever you type between there will be treated as a regular string. So we can add form control here. But, and that's now the tricky thing, you can also inject a dynamic value into that string with a special syntax which looks like this: $, and then again a pair of curly braces opening and closing. This adds content into the string, and what you pass between these curly braces can be any JavaScript expression. So a lot like our curly braces inside of JSX, here now inside of the template literal. So here we could now check if isValid is not true, hence the exclamation mark at the beginning. And if that's the case, we insert invalid here into this long string. Otherwise we enter nothing or simply an empty string in this case. So that simply will make sure that class name is either set to a string which has only form control blank nothing, or to a string which is form control blank invalid. So therefore now if we save this, if I submit this in an empty state, I get my error look here, my error style. But other than that, if I start typing, I go back to the non-error style, because we dynamically add this invalid class. And of course you can inject multiple things into that string, so you could repeat the same technique to add more dynamically added classes. And that's very powerful, because now you're back to working with CSS files and with classes only, and you can dynamically add or remove classes with this simple syntax. And it will be React's job to actually add or remove the classes in the DOM. You do what you can do best in React. You specify a goal, you specify some alternative states, for example that the goal sometimes is to have just form control, and sometimes form control and invalid, and React will make sure that the DOM, the real DOM, is updated accordingly. This is React in action, and this is how you can add styles dynamically. Being able to set styles and classes dynamically is super important, and you now learned how you can achieve this in React code. Now let's move to something else, and that would be the styling itself. Currently, we're using just CSS for that. Regular CSS files with regular selectors, mostly class selectors, but also sometimes combined with tag selectors, for example. We're importing these files into our component files, but as I emphasized multiple times, this does not result in those styles being scoped to this component only. So that means that if we had any other element anywhere else in the DOM that had a form control CSS class on it, this style, for example, would target it and would affect it. So it's not like we only care about form control elements in this component. No, every element on the entire page is affected, because by default, those styles are not scoped. Now, that is not necessarily a problem. You can, of course, be careful about your selectors. You can use class selectors or ID selectors here. It is regular CSS after all. You can use any selector. And you can ensure that the IDs and the classes you are selecting are only used in the places where you want to apply the styling. But of course, especially in larger projects, potentially with a lot of developers working on the code, it could happen that a name is used twice. That form control, for example, is used in different parts of the application, and therefore, unfortunately, styles spill over to other components, and you might want to avoid this. And there are various ways of avoiding this, and I will show you the two most popular approaches therefore. Approach number one is to use a package called styled components. And you can just search for styled components to find their official web page. Now on this page you can learn all about styled components. Here I will only introduce you to the package. If you want to use it, you can dive way deeper into it with those docs, but I will give you a thorough introduction, no worries. Styled components is a package that helps you build, guess what, components which have certain styles attached to them, where the styles really only affect the components to which they were attached and not any other components. Now, to get started, we need to install that package. And here you see the command you need to run for that. Now, if you've never installed packages before, keep in mind that our project here already has a couple of packages on which it depends. For example, React. And we're just adding one more package here. For that, you should quit your development server with Ctrl-C and run npm install --save styled-components inside of this project folder. Now this will download this package and store it in the node modules folder, and thereafter you'll be able to use it in this project. So let's wait for this to finish. Yep, here it is. And with this finished, you can restart the server with npm start. Now, if you're following along on Code Sandbox, you won't have such a terminal to add a dependency and to run npm install. And instead there, you have this dependencies area on the left here to add dependencies. There in this add dependency box, you would simply type the name of the dependency you want to add, like for example, styled components, and you'll get a bunch of suggestions here. And you would then simply pick the suggestion for the package you do want to add. So in this case, indeed, styled components. And boom, there you go. That's how this package gets installed there. You can then theoretically tweak the version that's being used, but the default version it installs for you should be fine. And with that, this package was now added and is now available for usage in your code. So now how do we use this package? Of course, you can learn all about it on the official page, but I will simply introduce you to it step by step. Now let's pick a place where we do want to use it. And let's say we want to style our button. We actually already have a button component, but we really only created this button component, if we're honest, because we wanted to have some default styling for a button. Nothing wrong with this approach, but here we could also use the styled components package to achieve this in a bit of an easier way. Now, how would we do this? We could rebuild our button here by creating a new constant button. And now what we store in there is not a functional component, but instead we now import styled from styled-components. This import is now available since you installed the package. We can get rid of that button CSS import, and instead now we use styled.button, and then we add two backticks like this. Now that certainly is a super weird syntax, and chances are you haven't seen that before. This is called a tagged template literal. It's a default JavaScript feature. It's not specific to this package, not specific to React. You could use it in any JavaScript project. And now what does this do? Well, button is simply a method on this styled object. Styled is an object we're importing from styled components, and there we can access the button method. It's just a special kind of method, you could say. Instead of being a method which you call like this with parentheses, you add these strange backticks after it. And again, that's just a default JavaScript syntax which is supported by JavaScript. In the end, this will be executed as a method behind the scenes, and what you pass in here will be passed into this method just in a special way. If you want to learn more about this tagged template literal syntax, you find a link attached where you can learn more. Here I don't want to waste your time since we won't need to know the internals here to proceed. For the moment, we just need to know that what we pass between these two backticks will kind of end up in that button method. And this button method, and that's the interesting part, will return a new button component. Actually, that styled package has methods for all HTML elements. It has a P method for a paragraph, h1, h2, and so on for the h1, h2 tags, div to create a div, and so on. It's all there, and here we need the button. So this overall expression will return a button, but a button with the styles we provide between these two backticks. The cool thing about the backtick syntax is that you can write a multi-line string like this, so you can split this across multiple lines without any extra syntax. And now we can just copy all the button styles here and add them in here. We'll need to tweak them, but that is something we can do. Now, what do we need to do to make this work in the end? This will return a button, and this button won't have a class of button, because we have no place where we would set up this class name. So instead, the styles we pass between the opening and closing backtick will directly affect this button. You therefore get rid of any selectors like this, and instead just paste in your styles just like that. And they will be added to the button element, which is returned by this method call, which is then stored in this button constant. Now for pseudo selectors, you can use the ampersand symbol. That's supported by that styled component package. This tells the package that you want to have a special case, a special pseudo selector in this case here, for this component which is created here. So in this case we're saying, hey, when this button here has focus, please apply this style. We can do the same here for hover, so and:hover and active. And this should now give us a button which has these styles. Now the button which is returned also by default applies all the props you might be passing to your own button component, which we're exporting here in the end. So we can still add an on-click prop, we can still set the type. That will all be forwarded by the styled components package to that core built-in button, which we previously wrapped or used ourselves, which is now used internally by this button method. We can now get rid of the React import up there because we're not dealing with JSX in this file anymore. And if we now save this, we should see that our application looks and works exactly as it did before. So this still works, but this is now our styled button. Now we can tell that there is something different if we inspect it in the developer tools. Of course it's a regular button. That's what this button method here in the end returns. But you see on that, there is a very strange class. Two strange classes to be precise. And these are class names we certainly didn't set up. These are class names dynamically generated by the styled components package. Because what this package does in the end is it looks at the styles we set up here, and then it wraps these styles into generated class names, where it guarantees that every class name is unique so that it can't spill over to other components of the app. And it will then add these classes as global CSS. But now, since we have unique class names for every styled component, the styled setup here will never be able to affect another component in the app, because these unique class names are really, well, unique per styled component. So that's how the styling is applied here, and that's how styled components work. Now, of course, we can also use styled components when we want to set up something dynamic. Styled components can be very useful, but can we also use them for our div here, for example? The answer is absolutely. If we want a styled component which we really only use in this file, we can also create it in that file. We can also create a brand new file as we did it for the button. But even though we're only using the button here in this app, you could argue that a button is a component you might be using in a lot of other places of the app as well. Now for the div, that might also be the case. Maybe you have other form inputs in other parts of the app as well. But to also show you that you can have multiple components per file, and that this might make sense if a component is really only getting used in that file, I will now create a brand new component in that course input file. Thus far, we always had one component per file, and that generally is a good rule to keep. But if you have a component that is really only getting used by that other component in that file, having both components in the same file can make sense too. So here I want to have my form control, for example. That name is ultimately up to you, but since I'll use it as a component in JSX, it should start with a capital character. And here again, I'll use the styled components package. So we can import styled from styled-components. And then here we can use styled, and in this case styled div, because I want to replace this div later. So I want to render a div. So if I go up, I have my styled div and now the backticks. And now in here, I want to have those styles. So we can grab all those form control styles here, copy them, and add them here between the backticks. Now just as before, get rid of the selectors. Just have your styles in here, and if you have something like this, where you have the class that is on that div which you're creating here, and then you want to target a nested element, you do the same as we did in the button with the pseudo selectors. You simply use and this tells styled components, I'm now talking about labels inside of this div. So that and always refers back to that component which is being created, and if you then want to have nested selectors you want to target, that is how you do it. So we can do this here, also for the input of course, and also here if we have an input that is focused, and also here if we want to check whether we have invalid on this div, and also here. With that, we have our styled component, our form control, which is this styled div. And now we can go back here and now replace this div here with our form control. If we save that, it generally works. And you will see here on that div, we also have these strange unique classes. You will also see that these are of course different classes than we have on the button, because as I said, you have unique classes per component to ensure that styles never spill over. But you'll also see that if I submit this in an empty state, we don't get the error state here. Now of course this can't work because we're no longer setting the invalid class here. And we need that invalid class here in our rules though, here and here. Now the good thing is that these styled components, so the components returned by these styled components functions, forward all props you set on them to the underlying component, so to the underlying div here. So we can still add a class name here, and here the value we want to pass in is either an empty string or invalid. We no longer need to set form control because the styles that were attached by form control are now already getting attached with the setup we have up there. So instead we just need to set this to invalid or nothing. So what we can do here is we can simply check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I add invalid as a string here. And with this syntax, I otherwise add nothing, which is perfectly fine because I need no other class if it is valid. But if it is invalid, the invalid class is getting added. And now with that, we have the same behavior as before here if we add goals. That, however, is only one way of doing this. We can do this, and it's perfectly fine, but you can also utilize another feature provided by styled components. You can also add props to your styled components and utilize those props inside of these backticks, so inside of your styles, to easily change styles dynamically. How does this work? Let's say here on our form control, when we use it down there, we want to add an invalid prop. Name is up to you because it's your component, and this should be true or false. The value we feed in, therefore, is not is valid. So if is valid is true, we feed in false because it's not invalid if is valid is true. If is valid is false, we feed in true because invalid is true if is valid is not true. So we set invalid to true if what the user entered was invalid. And this invalid prop can now be used between those backticks here. Now, how do we use it? Well, we wanted to change the border color of the input, for example, right? So we go to the place where we set up the border color, and now here, since you're between backticks, you can use this $ curly brace syntax you already know. And here you pass in an arrow function, which receives props as a parameter, and then should return the text that should be returned in this exact position. This function will be called by the styled components package, and for props, it will feed in all the props your component gets. So in this case, the invalid prop. So here we can now check if invalid is true, and if this is the case, we return red as a text, otherwise we stick to this grayish color. And this should of course be props.invalid. So with that, we're having this dynamic way of changing parts of the styles based on some props that are passed to our styled component. So this is this. Now we also want to set the background color. So I'll set background here to a dynamic value. And just as before, I check props invalid. And if it is invalid, I set this background to this light reddish color here we picked earlier. And otherwise, I'll set it to transparent. And with that, we can remove this style here. Now we can also already remove the label style, which was based on the existence of the invalid class, which we no longer add, and instead go up to that label styling here and add a color definition. And just as before, the value we set for color is dynamic. We provide this function which will be called by the styled components package, and we check if the invalid prop is true. If it is, we set a color of red, otherwise a color of black. And with this approach, if I save this, we got the exact same behavior as before, as you see. But now, by utilizing styled components only, and by utilizing this feature of dynamically changing parts of the styles based on the props that are set on your styled component. This sometimes can be hard to get into, this way of thinking, but it's also a pretty nice way of working with components and styles. Therefore, I wanted to show this to you. Now there's one last brief use case which I want to cover before I show you a more CSS-ish alternative. Now there's one last thing I want to cover when we talk about styling, and that would be media queries. Media queries, of course, often are important to get the right look. At the moment, if we preview this in a mobile device here, let's say the Pixel 2, doesn't matter which one you use, this is how it looks like. Let me zoom in a bit. This is how it looks like, and that's definitely all right. Right? Of course, you might want to add more to make this look good on mobile, but from a pure styling perspective, that looks good. Nothing is going beyond the edges, so that looks okay. But maybe we want to make sure that this button actually spans the entire width if we're on a small device, and only takes the space it needs if we're not on a mobile device. And that would be a scenario where we might want to use a media query. So let's go back to the button, and how can we now add a media query here when we're using styled components? It's actually super simple. You just add your media query here, add media, and define your criteria, for example, min width 768 pixels. And now you just put the styles into that media query that should affect this element when that condition here is met. That's all. You need no selector in there, nothing else, just the styles that should be applied to this component if this condition here for this media query is met. So here, that is actually now the media query for big devices, non-mobile devices, and there I want to set the width to auto. The default width, so if the media query is not met, can be set to 100% then up there. And as a result, if we save this, we have that big button here on mobile. But if I go to a bigger screen here, By zooming out a bit, you see now the button only takes as much space as it needs. And keep in mind, I'm zoomed in here so that you can see things a bit better, which is why for me I have to drag quite a bit to go to this big screen mode. But this is now a media query in action, and it's in action with the help of styled components. So styled components, definitely a nice package for, well, styling components and ensuring that components really only affect the styles on which you set them up. Now, whether you like styled components or not is an absolutely personal thing. There is no wrong or right here. Now, when it comes to me, personally, I prefer CSS in CSS files. I like the separation of CSS and JavaScript. I like having clean JavaScript files, and I simply like default CSS. Now, of course, you can absolutely stick to the CSS approach we used at the beginning, where you had global, non-scoped styles, and you as a developer had to make sure you're not accidentally reusing names, class names, you're not accidentally affecting the styles of other components. That is definitely one route you can take. You can also, however, take CSS to the next level with a feature called CSS modules. CSS modules is a feature which is only available in projects that are configured to support it, because it needs a code transformation that needs to be done before your code runs in the browser. Now, the good thing is the React projects created with Create React App, which we used, are already configured to support CSS modules. This is actually an excerpt from the official Create React App docs, where you learn how you can utilize CSS modules. And it's super simple to utilize CSS modules. So let me show you how it works. And let's start with the good old button again. Now, of course, you can stick to the styled component there, but I will comment this out and comment out this import, and instead add the import of React from React again, because I will comment in my own component again, this one, which uses JSX and which therefore needs the React import. Now we have the button CSS file, and in there we got the different styles, and we can leave that as it is. There's one thing we now need to change though. Of course, we need to add the import to the CSS file again, but instead of importing it like this, you now import it slightly different. You import classes or styles, totally up to you, from the CSS file. That's a syntax we haven't used before, but that is actually how you have to import from a CSS file if you want to use CSS modules. Actually, for that code transformation, which is needed behind the scenes, to happen, you also need to rename your file a little bit, your CSS file. You need to add .module in there so that it's named button.module.css. And then, of course, here you import from button.module.css. This is basically a signal to the underlying compilation process to transform the code so that CSS modules work. And I'll show you how they work behind the scenes in a second. So now we have this import, and now we need to do something with this imported styles thing here. We use it down there where we apply our class name. Instead of applying a string class name like this, you apply something dynamic. You refer to that styles thing, which you're importing from the CSS file. And that thing turns out to be an object. And in that object, you'll have every class you defined in your file as a property. So if I added a button class here in the CSS file, I now have the button property here. And that's all we need to do. This will apply this button class in a special way to this button element here. Let's see it in action. Let's save this and go back to our application. And we see the button looks the way it looked before. Now we see something interesting if we inspect this here in the DevTools. On the button, you see a very strange class. This is not the same class as added by styled components. Those classes looked like this here on the div. Instead, this looks a bit like the class we defined, button, but with more information added to it. It's basically component name underscore our class name in the CSS file, double underscore some unique hash. What CSS modules does, or what this concept of CSS modules does, what the build process does under the hood, is it takes those CSS classes in the CSS file and basically changes those class names to be unique. That's the core thing it does. For every component, it changes the class names of the classes you're importing here, so of the CSS file you're importing, to be unique. So if you import from the CSS file here in the button component, it will create unique classes, unique versions of all those styles and classes here for this component. And for that, it generates brand new class names that look like this. Inside of these class names, your styles will be. So it will just keep your styles. It will not touch those, but wrapped into this new class name. You can see this if you expand the head section here in the rendered DOM. There you will see a bunch of style tags. And if we now search for the one here it is for the button, we see that's this newly generated class name. Here we have our button styles, and that newly generated class name is also used on the focus style, on the hover, and on the active style. And with that, this CSS modules concept ensures that the CSS styles we set up in a CSS file are scoped to the component we import this file into. For that, we need to work with CSS classes here, because we then access those classes as properties on the imported styles object. This is how we basically make the connection between these dynamically generated class names, which we as a developer don't know in advance, and our components here. And that's also what you see here in the official docs. That's in the end all that's to it. This is how you can use CSS modules. And for me, that's actually the best of both worlds. We have our styles set up in CSS files, but they're still scoped to the components where we use them. So in the next module, let's also port the course input back to use the CSS file. And then I will also show you how to use media queries with CSS modules. So now that we use CSS modules, let's also use the concept here in the course input component. We got the course input CSS file, and as you learned, you need to change the name to .module.css. With that, I mean the file name. So course input.module.css. In the course input component, you then import from course input.module, and as you learned, you import something from there. Again, the name is totally up to you. Typically, you name it styles or classes or anything like that. We can remove the styled import from styled components because I'm going to comment out this form control. Like this. I'm not going to use it anymore. Instead, down there, I'll go back to my good old div. And on that div, I will add class name to styles.form control. And now we have a problem. This is an invalid property name, but I named my class form control in here. Well, it's not a problem. We just have to use a different syntax for accessing the property. We use the square brackets and wrap this name into single quotes. This is how we can also access properties in JavaScript, and with that we can also access properties with such a name. Because strings are valid keys in JavaScript objects. Alternatively, of course, you pick different CSS class names without dashes in them. Here, however, I'll stick to that, and therefore now we got our styling back. Now, of course, the invalid style is not getting applied. And the reason for that is simple. For that invalid style to be applied, we need to make sure that the invalid CSS class is added on the element. And currently, that's never happening. We're only adding form control, only adding this class, or the transformed CSS modules version of that class to be precise. We're never adding the transformed invalid class version. It is something we can also do easily though. We can go back to that backtick syntax to create a string where we inject values. And the first value I want to inject is that resolved class name here. So I inject this converted class name, which we're in the end extracting from that styles object, here into this string. With that, if we save this, nothing should change. And now, of course, just as before, we can add an additional class here. We can check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I add styles.invalid here, referring to that converted version of that invalid class. Converted because that's what the CSS module process will do behind the scenes. And invalid because the CSS class name is invalid in here. So with that, we're adding this converted version of our own class, this scoped version of this CSS styling, so to say, to this div if is valid is false. If we now save this and we go back, if I click add goal, it's red. If I type, it's no longer red. It gets red again, and so on. So this now works again, but now we're adding dynamic classes here with CSS modules. It's not really that different from normal classes, because these are normal classes. We just extract the converted class names as they were generated by CSS modules. That's all. And then we combine them as needed. Last but not least, let's see how media queries are set up in CSS modules. And for that, let's go back to the button. There, I had a media query in my styled components. So we can copy that and go to the CSS file which we're using now. And here, you just add a media query as you would always add it. Maybe here at the bottom. Let me get rid of these slashes. The important difference to styled components, of course, is that now you need your selector again. You always need that in CSS. The non-selector syntax here in styled components is really just a styled components feature because it processes your CSS code. This is not CSS code that would work like this in a browser because CSS always needs a selector, and that's why we need to add a selector here. With that, however, we got everything we need. We set the width here to 100% on small devices, and then on bigger screens, we reset it to auto. And that should be all that's needed. No other changes are required because I'm working on the same CSS class, which I'm already adding to the component here. So with that, you see I have the big button there, and on bigger screens, it's the smaller one. So that also works, and it also works with CSS modules. Now, ultimately, it's absolutely up to you which approach you prefer. I showed you the CSS only, the styled components, and the CSS modules approach. And I mentioned the different pros and cons. And you can simply use the approach you like. For the rest of this course, I will use CSS modules because I like that scoping and I like having my CSS code and my JavaScript code separated. But if you prefer a different approach, that's of course also perfectly fine.